I walked into Romano's Italian restaurant that Friday evening, my heels clicking against the marble floor, as I spotted my family clustered around a corner table. Empty plates and wine glasses told the story I already knew. They had finished dinner without me. Again. My mother, Carol, looked up from her tiramisu, her perfectly styled silver hair catching the candlelight, as she smiled that practiced smile I knew so well. My father, Robert, was wiping his mouth with his napkin, looking satisfied and content. My sister, Madison, barely glanced up from her phone. I approached their table, clutching my purse tighter as the familiar knot formed in my stomach. This was supposed to be their 30th anniversary celebration, and somehow I had become an afterthought once more. Carol reached into her designer handbag and pulled out what looked like a crisp $1,000 bill. The deep green paper seemed to shimmer under the restaurant lighting as she extended it toward me with a theatrical flourish. "Happy anniversary to us, sweetheart," she said with that sugary tone she used when she wanted something. "We ordered you the salmon, but since you missed dinner, this should cover it." Madison looked up from her phone screen, her blonde curls bouncing as she laughed. "You're our ATM," she announced loud enough for nearby tables to hear. The entire family erupted in laughter, and I felt heat rising in my cheeks. I stared at the bill in my mother's manicured fingers, feeling every pair of eyes in that section of the restaurant burning into me. 28 years old, working as a financial analyst at First National Bank, and my family still treated me like their personal cash dispenser. The humiliation was suffocating. Without thinking, I snatched the bill from her hand and tore it clean down the middle. The sound of ripping paper seemed to echo through the restaurant as gasps came from surrounding tables. Carol's mouth fell open in shock, while Robert's face turned an alarming shade of red. "Janet, what have you done?" Carol whispered, her voice trembling. I dropped the torn pieces onto their table, watching them flutter down like green confetti among the empty wine glasses. "I'm done being your ATM," I said, my voice steadier than I felt inside. Madison's eyes widened as she stared at the destroyed bill. "Are you insane? That was $1,000? Then maybe you should have saved me some dinner," I replied, turning on my heel and walking out of Romano's without looking back. The cool October air hit my face as I stepped onto the sidewalk, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my car keys. Behind me, I could hear raised voices coming from the restaurant, but I kept walking. My silver Honda Civic felt like a sanctuary as I slipped inside and started the engine. 3 months passed before I thought about that night again. I had avoided family gatherings, ignored their phone calls, and focused entirely on my work at the bank. My supervisor had even complimented my increased productivity and attention to detail. Then my phone rang on a Tuesday morning in January while I was reviewing loan applications. "Is this Janet Stevens?" The woman's voice was crisp and professional. "Yes, this is Janet. This is Agent Sarah Rodriguez with the United States Treasury Department. I need to speak with you about a financial matter. Are you available to meet this afternoon?" My stomach dropped as I glanced around the busy bank floor. "Is this about my accounts? I can pull my statements if there's a problem." "Ms. Stevens, this concerns evidence in a federal counterfeiting investigation. I'll be at your apartment at 2 o'clock if that works for you." The line went dead before I could respond. I stared at my phone screen, reading the unknown number over and over. Counterfeiting investigation. The words echoed in my head as I tried to focus on the loan application in front of me, but the numbers blurred together. At exactly 2 o'clock, my doorbell chimed. Agent Rodriguez stood in my hallway wearing a navy blue suit and carrying a leather briefcase. Her dark hair was pulled back in a professional bun, and her brown eyes seemed to assess everything as she stepped into my living room. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," she said, settling onto my beige couch and opening her briefcase. "I need to ask you about an incident that occurred 3 months ago at Romano's Italian restaurant." My blood turned cold. "How do you know about that?" Agent Rodriguez pulled out a manila folder and extracted several photographs. She spread them across my coffee table, and I recognized the interior of Romano's immediately. Security camera footage showed me tearing the bill and dropping the pieces onto my family's table. We've been investigating a sophisticated counterfeiting operation that's been circulating fake currency throughout the metropolitan area, she explained. The bill you destroyed that night was evidence. Evidence of what? My voice came out as barely a whisper. It was a counterfeit $1,000 bill, extremely high quality, almost impossible to detect without specialized equipment. Agent Rodriguez pointed to one of the photographs. The person who gave you that bill is connected to a larger criminal network. I sank into my armchair, my mind racing. My mother had given me a fake $1,000 bill. My family had handed me counterfeit money in front of a restaurant full of people. I need to know everything about your relationship with your family members, Agent Rodriguez continued. How often do they give you money? Have you noticed anything unusual about their financial situation? Questions flooded my mind faster than I could process them. How long had my family been involved with counterfeit money? Did they know the bill was fake? Were they testing me somehow? I don't understand, I said, my hands trembling. My parents have always been financially stable. My father owns a small printing business, and my mother works part-time at a boutique. Agent Rodriguez made notes in a small notebook. We'll need you to come to our field office tomorrow for a more detailed interview. There's something else you need to know. She reached into her briefcase again and pulled out a clear evidence bag containing fragments of the torn bill. Even through the plastic, I could see my fingerprints clearly visible on the green paper. Your fingerprints were already in our database, Agent Rodriguez said quietly. From when you were a child. The room seemed to spin around me as I stared at the evidence bag. Child fingerprints in a federal database meant only one thing. Somehow I had been connected to criminal activity before I was old enough to understand what was happening. What does that mean? I whispered. Agent Rodriguez closed her briefcase and stood up. It means this investigation goes much deeper than we initially thought, and it means you've been involved in this network much longer than you realize. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my fingerprints on that counterfeit bill and heard Agent Rodriguez's words echoing in my mind. You've been involved in this network much longer than you realize. I called in sick to work the next morning and drove to my childhood home in Maplewood. My parents were both at work, and I still had my old house key tucked away in my jewelry box. The familiar scent of Carol's vanilla candles hit me as I stepped through the front door, but instead of comfort, it brought an unsettling sense of dread. I started in my old bedroom, now converted into Carol's craft room. Sewing machines and fabric samples covered every surface, but I remembered this room differently. I remembered sitting at a small table with my father working on what he called art projects. We would spend hours carefully cutting paper and mixing inks, and he would always remind me to press my fingers firmly onto the paper to make sure the colors transferred properly. My hands trembled as I opened the closet door. Boxes of old family photographs lined the shelves, and I pulled them down one by one. As I flipped through decades of family pictures, inconsistencies began to emerge. In early photos, I looked different from the rest of the family. My dark hair and green eyes contrasted sharply with their blonde hair and blue eyes, but I had always been told I took after a distant relative. In the kitchen, I searched through drawers until I found the manila folder where Carol kept important documents: birth certificates, social security cards, insurance papers. My birth certificate looked newer than it should, with crisp edges and bright white paper compared to the yellow documents around it. The hospital name seemed familiar, but something about the formatting looked wrong. I photographed everything with my phone, my heart pounding as I moved through the house like a detective investigating my own life. In the basement, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Behind Robert's workbench, hidden behind a false panel I accidentally knocked loose, was a small safe. The combination lock had 4 digits, and on a desperate whim, I tried my birthday. The safe clicked open. Inside were printing plates, bottles of specialized ink sheets of currency paper and equipment I recognized from my childhood art projects. My father hadn't been teaching me arts and crafts. He'd been training me to help with counterfeiting operations. Among the equipment, I found a folder labeled Janet Training Records. Inside were photographs of me as a young child carefully placing my small hands on sheets of currency paper, while Robert guided my movements. Notes in his handwriting documented my progress. Age 6. Excellent finger pressure, natural talent for detailed work. Age 8. Can cut security strips without supervision. Age 10. Ready for quality control duties. My legs gave out and I sat down hard on the concrete basement floor. Every memory of bonding with my father through our special projects took on a sinister new meaning. He had been grooming me to become part of his criminal operation from the time I could hold a pair of scissors. But there was something else in the safe that shattered my world completely. At the bottom of the folder underneath the training photographs was a legal document that changed everything I thought I knew about myself. Adoption papers. Official court documents showing that Janet Stevens was not my birth name. According to the paperwork, I had been adopted at age 3 from a teenage mother who could not provide for me. The adoption had been arranged privately outside the normal state system. My original name was Janet Lynn Morrison. I photographed every document, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone steady. The adoption papers included a brief medical history of my biological parents and a single photograph of a young woman with dark hair and green eyes who looked exactly like me. The woman in the photograph was my real mother, and according to the documentation, she had died in a car accident when I was 12 years old. As I sat in that basement surrounded by evidence of my father's crimes and the truth about my identity, one terrible realization crystallized in my mind. I hadn't been adopted by the Stevens family because they wanted a daughter. I had been chosen specifically because I fit their needs for their criminal enterprise. They needed a child they could mold and manipulate, a child with no other family to ask questions, a child whose fingerprints could be embedded in their operation from the very beginning, making her the perfect fall guy if they were ever caught. My phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Rodriguez. Interview scheduled for 10 a.m. tomorrow. Bring any family documents you think might be relevant. I stared at the message while surrounded by 25 years of lies. Tomorrow, I would have to decide whether to protect the people who raised me or expose the truth about what they had done to an innocent child. But as I looked at the photograph of my biological mother, her young face full of hope and love, I knew there was really no choice at all. The next morning, I sat across from Agent Rodriguez in a sterile conference room at the federal building downtown. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I spread the documents I had discovered across the metal table. Her expression grew darker with each photograph and piece of evidence I presented. "These adoption papers are highly irregular," she said, studying the legal documents through a magnifying glass. "The law firm that handled this doesn't exist anymore, and the judge who signed off died 15 years ago under suspicious circumstances." I felt sick as she continued examining the evidence. "What do you mean, suspicious circumstances?" "Judge Harold Brennan was investigating corruption in private adoption cases when his car went off a bridge during a snowstorm." Agent Rodriguez looked up from the documents. "No other vehicles involved, but the accident occurred on a clear, straight stretch of road he had driven safely for 30 years. The implications hung heavy in the air between us. Judge Brennan had been asking too many questions about adoptions like mine, and someone had made sure he stopped asking. "Tell me about your biological mother," Agent Rodriguez said, pointing to the photograph I had found. "What do you remember about learning of her death?" I closed my eyes, trying to recall conversations from my childhood. Robert told me she died when I was 12. He said it was better that I didn't dwell on the past, that I should focus on the family that actually raised me. The words tasted bitter now as I spoke them. He made it sound like she was irresponsible, that she got herself killed through reckless behavior. Agent Rodriguez made notes as I spoke. "According to these medical records, your biological mother was clean and sober when she placed you for adoption. She was working 2 jobs to try to keep you, but she was only 17 and had no family support." She pulled out a thick file from her briefcase and opened it to reveal pages of investigation notes and photographs. We've been looking into your biological mother's death as part of a larger investigation. Rebecca Lynn Morrison didn't die in a random car accident. The room felt like it was spinning as Agent Rodriguez continued. She had been trying to locate you for 9 years. She got clean finished high school and earned her nursing degree. She started asking questions about the adoption, demanding to know where her daughter was placed. Tears burned my eyes as I processed this information. My real mother hadn't forgotten about me. She had been fighting to find me, to build a life where we could be together again. 3 days before her death, Rebecca contacted a private investigator. Agent Rodriguez said, sliding a business card across the table. She had traced the adoption to Robert Stevens and was planning to file a legal challenge to gain visitation rights. I picked up the faded business card with trembling fingers. Morrison Investigations. The investigator had the same last name as my biological mother and me. Her older brother, Agent Rodriguez explained. Thomas Morrison spent 2 years investigating his sister's death, but he was threatened repeatedly and eventually had to close his business and leave the state. The picture was becoming clearer, and it was more horrifying than I had imagined. My biological mother hadn't abandoned me. She had been murdered because she threatened to expose the adoption scheme and reclaim her daughter. There's something else, Agent Rodriguez said quietly. The adoption wasn't just about placing you with a family. It was about creating false identities and paperwork trails that could be used for money laundering operations. She opened another folder containing financial records and bank statements. Robert Stevens has been using your identity since you were 3 years old. Credit cards, bank accounts, business licenses. Your Social Security number has been generating income and transactions for 25 years. I stared at the evidence in front of me, feeling completely hollow inside. Every birthday card, every Christmas present, every family vacation had been part of an elaborate criminal operation. I wasn't their daughter. I was their most valuable asset. What about Madison? I asked, my voice barely audible. Is she adopted too? Agent Rodriguez nodded grimly. Madison Parker was adopted 2 years after you. Her biological parents died in a house fire that we're now investigating as arson. She pointed to another photograph in the file. She's been actively participating in the counterfeiting operation since she was 16. The conference room felt suffocating as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. This wasn't just about fake money. This was about child trafficking, identity theft, murder, and decades of organized crime. We need your help to build a case against them, Agent Rodriguez said. But I have to warn you, they've been preparing for this possibility for years. They have evidence planted that makes you look like the mastermind of the entire operation. My blood went cold. What kind of evidence? Agent Rodriguez pulled out a final folder and opened it to reveal bank surveillance photos. The images showed me depositing money into various accounts, signing documents, and meeting with people I didn't recognize. These photos span the last 5 years, she said. They show you conducting what appears to be money laundering activities. The dates and times correspond with legitimate work you were doing at the bank, but taken out of context, they paint a very different picture. I studied the photographs, recognizing my face and my clothing in each one. But the activities shown weren't what I remembered doing. Somehow my family had documented routine banking transactions and twisted them to look like criminal behavior. They've been building a case against you since you started working at the bank, Agent Rodriguez continued. If we don't move quickly, you're going to be charged as the leader of this counterfeiting ring, while the real criminals disappear with millions of dollars. The weight of 25 years of manipulation pressed down on me like a physical force. I had been raised, trained, and positioned to take the fall for crimes I never knew I was committing. But as I stared at the photograph of my biological mother, I felt something stirring inside me that I had never experienced before. It wasn't the desperate need to please my adoptive family or the fear of disappointing them that had driven me for so many years. It was anger. Pure righteous anger at the people who had stolen my life, murdered my real mother, and spent decades preparing to destroy me when I was no longer useful to them. What do you need me to do? I asked Agent Rodriguez. Agent Rodriguez handed me a small recording device that looked like an ordinary pen. "We need documented evidence of their current operations," she explained. "This will record conversations up to 12 hours and it's completely undetectable." The plan was simple, but terrifying. I would resume contact with my family, pretending that my anger had cooled and I was ready to apologize for embarrassing them at the restaurant. I would gather evidence of their ongoing criminal activities while federal agents built their case. 3 days later, I called Madison and suggested we meet for lunch. She agreed immediately, which should have been my first warning that something was wrong. Madison never made time for family unless she needed something. We met at a small cafe downtown, and I arrived early to activate the recording pen. Madison breezed in 20 minutes late, wearing designer clothes I knew she couldn't afford on her salary, as a part-time receptionist at a doctor's office. "Janet, I'm so glad you called," she said, sliding into the booth across from me. "Mom and Dad have been worried sick about you." I forced a smile and apologized for my behavior at the anniversary dinner. Madison seemed to accept my explanation that work stress had made me overreact to their teasing. We ordered salads and coffee, and I steered the conversation toward their financial situation. "I keep thinking about that $1,000 bill," I said carefully. "Where did Mom get something like that? I didn't even know they still made them." Madison's expression flickered for just a moment before she recovered. "Oh, you know Dad. He's always collecting weird old money from estate sales and auctions." But her answer didn't make sense. Estate sales wouldn't have crisp new $1,000 bills. And Robert had never shown any interest in collecting anything except printing equipment and rare inks. After lunch, Madison suggested we go shopping at the mall. As we walked through the department stores, I noticed her paying for everything with cash. Specifically, she was using $20 and $50 bills that looked unusually crisp and new. "Madison, where are you getting all this cash?" I asked as she bought a $300 purse without hesitation. "I've been doing some freelance work," she said vaguely. "Design projects for small businesses." When we stopped at the food court for coffee, Madison excused herself to make a phone call. I followed at a distance and listened as she spoke to someone in hushed, urgent tones. "No, she doesn't suspect anything," Madison said into her phone. "She's still the same naive little sister she's always been." My stomach dropped as I realized she was talking about me. "The timeline is moving up," Madison continued. "We need to transfer the accounts by next week and then we can activate the final phase." I moved closer, hiding behind a pillar as Madison finished her conversation. "Don't worry about Janet," she said. "When this is over, she'll be exactly where we need her to be." When Madison returned to our table, I pretended to be checking my phone, but my hands were shaking as I realized my supposed sister had been planning something involving my accounts and some kind of timeline. The next day, I decided to follow Madison to see where she was going for her freelance design work. I called in sick to the bank and positioned myself outside her apartment building at 7 in the morning. Madison emerged at 8:30 and drove to an industrial complex on the outskirts of town. I followed at a safe distance and watched her park outside a nondescript warehouse with no visible signage. I parked across the street and used binoculars I had borrowed from my neighbor to watch the building. Over the next 2 hours, I saw approximately 15 people enter and leave the warehouse. Several of them were carrying briefcases and manila envelopes. Around 11 o'clock, Madison came outside and stood in the parking lot talking to a man in his 50s wearing expensive clothing. I adjusted the binoculars and nearly dropped them when I recognized the man. It was Detective Frank Morrison, the police officer who had supposedly investigated my biological mother's car accident 20 years ago. The same Morrison who had concluded that Rebecca's death was accidental and closed the case without further investigation. Madison and Detective Morrison spoke for several minutes before he handed her a thick envelope and drove away in an unmarked police car. Madison returned to the warehouse carrying the envelope. I spent another hour watching the building before Madison emerged again, this time with 2 teenage boys I recognized from our neighborhood. They looked nervous and kept glancing around as Madison led them to her car. That's when I realized what I was witnessing. Madison wasn't just involved in counterfeiting money. She was recruiting new people into the operation, including minors from our own community. I followed them to a parking garage downtown where Madison met with 3 more adults I didn't recognize. Money and documents changed hands, and I watched in horror as Madison handed one of the teenage boys what looked like a fake driver's license. The recording pen in my purse captured everything, but I knew I needed more evidence. As Madison prepared to leave with the teenagers, I made a decision that terrified me. I got out of my car and walked directly toward the group. "Madison," I called out, pretending to be surprised to see her. "What are you doing here?" The color drained from her face as she saw me approaching. The adults she had been meeting with immediately scattered, leaving Madison alone with the 2 teenage boys. "Janet," she stammered, "I was just helping these kids with some school project research." But the boys looked panicked, and one of them was clutching what was obviously a fake identification document. "Research for what?" I asked, looking directly at the teenager holding the ID. Madison moved quickly to position herself between me and the boys. "Actually, we were just finishing up. Come on, guys, let's go." But it was too late. I had seen enough to understand that my sister was actively recruiting children into criminal activities, the same way I had been recruited 25 years ago. As Madison hurried the teenagers away, she turned back to look at me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't embarrassment or annoyance. It was cold calculation, like she was evaluating a problem that needed to be solved. "Janet," she said quietly, "you shouldn't have seen this." The threat in her voice was unmistakable. My own sister, the person I had grown up with and trusted my entire life, was warning me to stay quiet about criminal activity involving children. That night, I called Agent Rodriguez and arranged an emergency meeting. As I handed over the recording pen and described what I had witnessed, I realized that the federal investigation was about to uncover something much larger than a simple counterfeiting operation. "Detective Morrison has been on our radar for years," Agent Rodriguez said after listening to the recordings. "We suspected he was connected to organized crime, but we could never prove it." She looked at the photographs I had taken of the warehouse and the people Madison had been meeting with. "This confirms that your family's operation has law enforcement protection. That's how they've been operating for so long without getting caught." As the full scope of the conspiracy became clear, Agent Rodriguez delivered news that made my blood run cold. "Janet, we have reason to believe that your family is planning to frame you for the entire operation and then eliminate you as a witness." The room spun around me as she continued. "We intercepted communications suggesting that they're going to plant evidence in your apartment and then report you to authorities. Once you're arrested, they believe you'll have an accident in police custody." I realized that my decision to investigate Madison had accelerated their timeline. They now knew I was asking questions and getting too close to the truth. "How long do we have?" I whispered. Agent Rodriguez checked her watch. "Based on the communications we've intercepted, probably less than 48 hours. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls from my mother. My hands trembled as I listened to increasingly frantic voicemails pleading with me to come home immediately for a family emergency. Agent Rodriguez had warned me this might happen. Carol was trying to lure me back to the house where they could control the situation. Instead of calling back, I drove to a coffee shop across town and used a payphone to contact the federal field office. "They're moving faster than we anticipated," Agent Rodriguez said when she met me at a diner 20 minutes later. "We intercepted communications between Robert and Detective Morrison early this morning. They're planning to execute their frame job today." She spread surveillance photographs across the table showing Robert entering my apartment building at 6 in the morning, carrying a briefcase and wearing maintenance coveralls. The photos were time-stamped just 3 hours after I had left to meet with Agent Rodriguez. "He had 45 minutes inside your apartment," she explained. "Our technical team is analyzing what he might have planted, but we can't enter without compromising the investigation." My stomach churned as I realized Robert had violated my personal space-planting evidence that would destroy my life. The apartment I had worked so hard to afford the sanctuary where I felt safe and independent had been contaminated by his criminal enterprise. There's more, Agent Rodriguez continued grimly. Madison filed a police report this morning claiming that you've been exhibiting erratic behavior and making threats against the family. She handed me a copy of the police report and I read Madison's lies with growing horror. According to her statement, I had been stealing money from my workplace using drugs and threatening to hurt my parents if they tried to intervene. She's establishing a narrative, Agent Rodriguez explained. When they discover evidence in your apartment, it will seem consistent with the behavior she's documented. The manipulation was breathtakingly sophisticated. For years, my family had been building a case against me, creating documentation and witnesses that would support their version of events when the time came to sacrifice me. What about the teenagers I saw Madison recruiting? I asked. Agent Rodriguez's expression darkened. We're working on tracking them down, but it's complicated. Many of these kids come from unstable family situations where they're vulnerable to manipulation. Madison targets children who won't be missed if something happens to them. The realization that Madison was essentially trafficking children into criminal activity made me feel physically sick. How many young people had been destroyed by my family's operation? How many families had been torn apart by their greed? My phone buzzed with a text message from Robert. Janet, please come home. Your mother is in the hospital. She needs you. Agent Rodriguez read the message over my shoulder and shook her head. It's a trap. Carol is fine. We have surveillance on the hospital and she hasn't been admitted. But even knowing it was a lie, the message triggered something deep in my conditioning. 25 years of being trained to drop everything and respond to family emergencies made my chest tight with anxiety. They know exactly how to manipulate you, Agent Rodriguez observed. They've had your entire life to study your responses and program your reactions. She was right. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to rush home and help my mother, even though my rational mind knew it was a setup. The psychological control they had established was that powerful. Agent Rodriguez received a phone call that made her face go pale. After a brief conversation, she hung up and turned to me with urgent intensity. We have a problem. Detective Morrison just obtained a search warrant for your apartment. He's going to discover the evidence Robert planted this morning and then issue an arrest warrant for you. My world tilted as the implications became clear. In a matter of hours, I would be a wanted fugitive charged with federal crimes I had never committed. Once I was in police custody with Detective Morrison controlling the situation, my family could eliminate the only witness to their decades of criminal activity. What do we do? I whispered. Agent Rodriguez gathered the photographs and documents from the table. We accelerate our timeline. We're going to arrest your entire family today before they can complete their frame job. She made several phone calls while I sat in stunned silence, watching my entire world collapse around me. Federal agents were mobilizing across the city to simultaneously arrest Robert Carroll Madison and their associates before they could destroy evidence or flee. There's something else you need to know, Agent Rodriguez said after finishing her calls. We found Detective Morrison's connection to your biological mother's death. She pulled out a file containing police reports and witness statements from 20 years ago. Morrison wasn't just the investigating officer. He was the one who forced Rebecca's car off the road that night. The coffee shop seemed to fade away as I processed this information. The police officer who had covered up my mother's murder was the same man who was now trying to frame me for crimes committed by her killers. Morrison has been Robert's inside contact at the police department for over 2 decades, Agent Rodriguez continued. He's protected their operation, eliminated threats, and helped them maintain their cover as a normal American family. My hands clenched into fists as rage overwhelmed me. These people hadn't just stolen my childhood and identity. They had murdered my real mother and spent 25 years profiting from their crime while I unknowingly helped them. I want to be there when you arrest them, I said. Agent Rodriguez shook her head. Too dangerous. They're desperate now, and desperate criminals make unpredictable choices. But I wasn't backing down. After a lifetime of being manipulated and controlled, I needed to see justice served with my own eyes. My phone rang and Robert's name appeared on the screen. Agent Rodriguez motioned for me to answer while she activated recording equipment. Janet, sweetheart. Robert's voice was strained but trying to sound casual. Your mother really is worried about you. Why don't you come home so we can talk? I'm fine, Dad, I replied, using the word that now felt like poison in my mouth. I just need some space to think. Space to think about what? There was an edge to his voice now. Has someone been filling your head with crazy ideas? Agent Rodriguez held up a note reminding me to keep him talking while federal agents moved into position around my family's house. I've been thinking about my childhood, I said carefully, about those art projects we used to do together. Silence stretched across the phone line before Robert responded. Those were special times, weren't they? Just you and me working together on something important. His words confirmed everything. He was admitting to involving me in counterfeiting operations when I was a child, and he didn't even seem to understand how wrong it had been. Robert, I said, dropping the pretense entirely. I know what you did to my real mother. Another long silence, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed completely. The fake paternal warmth was gone, replaced by cold calculation. Janet, you need to be very careful about the accusations you make. You've been involved in this operation your entire life. Your fingerprints are on evidence going back 20 years. When the police investigate this family, who do you think they're going to arrest? The threat was unmistakable. He was reminding me that I could be charged as an accomplice to crimes I had committed as a child under his manipulation. But here's the thing, Robert, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. The police aren't going to investigate this family. The federal government is. I hung up the phone and looked at Agent Rodriguez. How long before the arrests? She checked her watch. 20 minutes. 18 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time it was Carol, and she was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words. Janet, please, you have to listen to me. She gasped between tears. Your father is very sick. The doctors say he doesn't have much time left. Agent Rodriguez was monitoring the call and shook her head, indicating this was another manipulation tactic. But Carol's crying sounded genuinely desperate, and despite everything I knew about her, my heart clenched with familiar guilt. Mom, slow down, I said. What are you talking about? Cancer, she whispered. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors say he has maybe 3 months to live. I closed my eyes, feeling the old conditioning kick in. Carol had always been expert at using emotional manipulation to control me, and the news of Robert's supposed illness triggered every protective instinct I had developed over 25 years. He's been hiding it from everyone, Carol continued. He didn't want you and Madison to worry. But Janet, if he goes to prison now, he'll die alone in a cell. Is that what you want for the man who raised you? Agent Rodriguez slid a note across the table. Stalling tactic. No medical records indicate cancer diagnosis. But Carol wasn't finished. I'm coming to see you, she announced. We need to talk face to face about this family before you make a decision that destroys all of us. The line went dead before I could respond. Agent Rodriguez immediately made phone calls to redirect surveillance teams, but Carol was already in motion. 30 minutes later, Carol knocked on the door of the diner where Agent Rodriguez and I were meeting. She looked haggard and older than I had ever seen her, with red eyes and trembling hands, as she slid into the booth across from me. Thank you for seeing me, she said, glancing nervously at Agent Rodriguez. Is this the federal agent who's been filling your head with lies? Carol Stevens, Agent Rodriguez said formally. You're under investigation for federal crimes, including counterfeiting, money laundering, and conspiracy. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. Carol laughed bitterly. Conspiracy Agent Rodriguez, my daughter, has been the mastermind of this operation since she was 16 years old. We've been trying to protect her from herself for years. The audacity of her lie took my breath away. Carol was sitting across from me, attempting to convince a federal agent that I had somehow coerced my adoptive parents into committing crimes. Janet has always been obsessed with money. Carol continued, reaching into her purse. She's the one who convinced Robert to expand the printing business into specialized currency work. She pulled out a manila envelope and spread documents across the table. Bank statements, business licenses, and financial records, all bearing my forged signature and linking me to various criminal enterprises. These documents showed Janet establishing shell companies and offshore accounts, Carol said to Agent Rodriguez. She's been using Robert's printing equipment to produce counterfeit currency and then laundering the money through her position at the bank. Agent Rodriguez examined the papers with professional detachment, but I could see they were extremely sophisticated forgeries. My family had spent years creating a paper trail that made me appear guilty of everything they had actually done. Carol, I said quietly, I was a child. You can't seriously expect anyone to believe that a 6-year-old masterminded a counterfeiting operation. But you weren't just 6 years old, Carol replied. You were different from other children, manipulative, calculating. We tried to give you a normal childhood, but you were always drawn to criminal behavior. She reached back into her purse and pulled out a thick folder labeled Janet Psychological Evaluations. Inside were what appeared to be professional assessments from child psychologists, all documenting behavioral problems and antisocial tendencies. Dr. Patricia Williams evaluated Janet when she was 8 years old, Carol said, handing the papers to Agent Rodriguez. She diagnosed early onset conduct disorder and recommended intensive intervention. I stared at the psychological reports in disbelief. The evaluations described a child who was aggressive, manipulative, and showed no empathy for others. According to the documents, I had tortured animals stolen from classmates and exhibited concerning sexual behavior. These are lies, I whispered. I never did any of those things. But the documents looked official, complete with letterhead from established psychological practices and signatures from licensed therapists. Agent Rodriguez studied the papers carefully before looking up at Carol. Dr. Patricia Williams lost her license 15 years ago for falsifying patient records and insurance fraud. Carol's composure cracked slightly. Well, there were other evaluations, all conducted by professionals who were later convicted of fraud or stripped of their licenses. Agent Rodriguez continued. It seems like you put considerable effort into creating a false psychological profile for Janet. We were trying to get her help, Carol protested. When traditional therapists wouldn't believe how disturbed she was, we had to find doctors who would document the truth. The conversation was becoming surreal. Carol was simultaneously claiming that I was a criminal mastermind and a psychologically disturbed child who needed protection. Her story kept shifting as Agent Rodriguez exposed each lie. Let's talk about Janet's biological mother, Agent Rodriguez said. Tell me about Rebecca Morrison. Carol's face went completely white. I don't know what you're talking about. You don't remember the young woman whose daughter you adopted, the one who died in a car accident after trying to locate Janet. Tragic accident, Carol said quickly. Very sad. But it had nothing to do with our family. Agent Rodriguez pulled out crime scene photographs from Rebecca's accident and placed them on the table. Your husband, Robert, was seen at the accident location 2 hours before Rebecca's car went off the road. Carol stared at the photographs, her hands beginning to shake more violently. Robert was working that night. He couldn't have been anywhere near that accident. We have gas station surveillance footage showing Robert purchasing supplies that were found at the accident scene, Agent Rodriguez said. Road flares, reflective tape, and industrial cable. The evidence was overwhelming, and I watched Carol realize that her decades of lies were finally collapsing around her. But instead of confessing, she made one final desperate attempt at manipulation. Janet, she said, turning to me with tears streaming down her face. Even if everything this agent is saying is true, Robert is still dying. He's the only father you've ever known. Can you really send a dying man to prison? She reached across the table and grabbed my hands. I know we've made mistakes. I know we haven't been perfect parents, but we loved you the best way we knew how. Doesn't that count for anything? For a moment, looking into Carol's tear-filled eyes, I felt the old familiar tug of guilt and obligation. 25 years of conditioning was difficult to overcome, even when faced with overwhelming evidence of abuse and manipulation. But then I thought about Rebecca Morrison, my real mother, who had died trying to find me. I thought about the teenagers Madison was recruiting into criminal activity. I thought about all the victims of my family's crimes over the past 2 decades. "Carol," I said, pulling my hands away from hers, "you didn't love me, you used me." Agent Rodriguez's phone buzzed with a text message. She read it and looked up at Carol with grim satisfaction. "Mrs. Stevens, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, counterfeiting money laundering, and child endangerment." As federal agents entered the diner to take Carol into custody, she turned back to me with an expression of pure hatred. "You have no idea what you've just done," she hissed. "You think you're the victim in this story, but you're going to discover that being part of this family was the only thing protecting you from the truth about yourself." Even in handcuffs, even facing federal charges, Carol was still trying to manipulate me with cryptic threats and psychological warfare. But as I watched them lead her away, I felt something I had never experienced before in my entire life: freedom. With Carol and Robert in federal custody, Agent Rodriguez moved quickly to secure evidence before their associates could destroy it. I found myself in the unprecedented position of helping to investigate my own family's criminal enterprise. The warehouse where I had followed Madison became the center of a massive federal operation. Teams of agents spent 3 days cataloging evidence, and what they found exceeded every estimate of the operation's scope. 22 years of financial records. Agent Rodriguez told me as we toured the facility under heavy security. Your family wasn't just counterfeiting currency. They were producing fake identification documents, social security cards, birth certificates, and passports for a network spanning 14 states. Room after room contained sophisticated printing equipment, computers, and supplies for document fraud. In one section, agents had discovered a complete photo studio where Madison had been taking pictures of new recruits for false identification documents. "How many people were involved?" I asked, staring at filing cabinets full of client information. "We're still counting, but preliminary estimates suggest over 300 active participants." Agent Rodriguez opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder labeled New Prospects, Under 18. Inside were photographs and personal information for 67 children ranging in age from 12 to 17. Madison had been systematically targeting vulnerable minors from broken homes runaways and kids aging out of the foster care system. "This is a human trafficking operation disguised as a family business," Agent Rodriguez explained. "Your adoptive parents weren't just criminals. They were running a network that exploited children for financial gain." Among the evidence agents had found detailed psychological profiles of potential victims. Madison had been studying child development and psychology to better understand how to manipulate young people into criminal activity. She targeted kids who were desperate for family connections. Agent Rodriguez said, showing me Madison's handwritten notes. Children who had been abandoned or abused were most susceptible to promises of belonging and financial security. Reading Madison's cold clinical analysis of childhood trauma made me physically sick. She had turned human suffering into a recruitment strategy. But the most shocking discovery was in Robert's private office at the back of the warehouse. Hidden behind a false wall, agents found what they called the archive. Thousands of photographs documenting the operation's history stretched back 30 years. Pictures of children learning to use printing equipment, teenagers practicing document forgery, and families being inducted into the criminal network. "Janet," Agent Rodriguez said quietly, "you need to see this." She led me to a wall covered with photographs from my own childhood. Images I had never seen before showed me at various ages, always working with printing equipment or handling what I now recognized as counterfeit documents. But these weren't the casual family photos I remembered. These were professional surveillance-style images carefully documenting my involvement in criminal activities for future use as evidence. "They were building a case against you from the day you were adopted," Agent Rodriguez explained. "Every interaction you had with their criminal operation was photographed and cataloged. In the center of the wall was a detailed timeline of my life with annotations in Robert's handwriting. Age 3, adoption complete. Subject shows high intelligence and manual dexterity. Age 5, beginning basic training with currency handling. Age 7, demonstrates natural talent for detailed work. Subject emotionally attached to father figure, highly manipulable. The clinical language Robert used to describe my childhood development was horrifying. To him, I hadn't been a daughter to love and protect. I had been a subject to study and exploit. Age 16, subject ready for advanced operations. Emotional conditioning complete. Will accept blame for family activities if necessary. Age 22, subject employed at bank providing perfect cover for money laundering. Subject believes family activities are legitimate business. Agent Rodriguez pointed to the most recent entry on the timeline. Age 28, subject showing signs of independence and questioning family narrative. Prepare for disposal if cooperation cannot be maintained. Disposal. Robert had been planning to kill me if I became a liability to the operation. How long have you known about this timeline? I asked. We discovered it yesterday, Agent Rodriguez replied, but it confirmed intelligence we had been gathering for months. Your family wasn't just planning to frame you for their crimes. They were planning to eliminate you entirely. She led me to another section of the archive where agents had found detailed plans for my murder. Robert had researched various methods from staged accidents to drug overdoses, all designed to look like suicide or misadventure. According to these documents, they planned to make it appear that you killed yourself out of guilt after being exposed as the leader of the counterfeiting operation, Agent Rodriguez explained. The methodical planning that had gone into destroying my life was staggering. Every aspect of my murder had been carefully considered, from the timing to the evidence that would be left behind. But Robert had made one critical mistake in his planning. He had documented everything. Criminals like your adoptive father are often narcissistic, Agent Rodriguez observed. They want credit for their intelligence and planning, even if they can never publicly claim it. That's why he kept such detailed records of the operation. Those records were now providing federal prosecutors with an airtight case against the entire network. Robert's need to document his criminal genius had become the evidence that would destroy him. What about Madison? I asked. Has she been arrested? Agent Rodriguez's expression darkened. Madison disappeared the day we arrested your parents. We have teams searching for her, but she had access to false identification documents and significant cash reserves. The realization that Madison was still free made my stomach clench with anxiety. She knew I was cooperating with federal agents, and she had been trained in the same manipulation and violence that Robert had mastered. We're providing you with protection, Agent Rodriguez said, noticing my concern. Madison is desperate and dangerous, but she's also alone now. Without Robert's support and resources, she won't be able to stay hidden for long. As we finished touring the warehouse, Agent Rodriguez received a phone call that made her smile for the first time in days. We found Detective Morrison, she announced after hanging up. He was trying to board a flight to Mexico using a false passport. He's being transported back here for questioning. With Morrison in custody, the corrupt police protection that had shielded my family's operation for decades was finally broken. Federal agents could now safely investigate related crimes without worrying about evidence being destroyed or witnesses being threatened. Morrison has already started talking, Agent Rodriguez said. He's trying to negotiate a plea deal by providing information about other criminal networks he's been protecting. The scope of corruption was expanding beyond my family's operation to include other organized crime activities throughout the region. Morrison's arrest was opening new investigations that could take years to fully resolve. But for me, the most important revelation came when Agent Rodriguez showed me Morrison's confession about my biological mother's murder. He admits to forcing Rebecca off the road that night, she said. He was following Robert's orders to eliminate a threat to the adoption scheme. Finally, after 20 years, my real mother was going to get justice. The people who killed her were in federal custody, and their entire criminal empire was collapsing around them. As I stood in the warehouse surrounded by evidence of my family's crimes, I felt a sense of purpose I had never experienced before. These weren't just abstract legal proceedings. This was about protecting other children from the exploitation I had endured and ensuring that Rebecca Morrison's death would not be forgotten. "Agent Rodriguez," I said, "I want to do more than just provide testimony. I want to help you find the other victims and shut down every part of this network." She looked at me with respect and determination. "Janet, I was hoping you would say that." The next morning brought news that changed everything I thought I knew about my biological family. Agent Rodriguez called me at 6 in the morning with urgency in her voice. "Janet, we have a problem. Morrison gave us information about your biological mother's family that puts someone in immediate danger." I met her at the federal building 30 minutes later, where she led me to a secure briefing room. On the table were photographs and documents I had never seen before. "Your biological mother had a younger sister named Patricia," Agent Rodriguez explained. "She's been living in Phoenix for the past 15 years, working as a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital." I stared at the photographs showing a woman with dark hair and green eyes who looked remarkably like Rebecca, like me. "Robert's associates have been monitoring Patricia since Rebecca's death," Agent Rodriguez continued. "They wanted to make sure she didn't start asking questions about her sister's accident." The realization that I had family I never knew about was overwhelming, but the immediate threat to Patricia's safety pushed personal emotions aside. "What kind of monitoring?" I asked. Agent Rodriguez opened a file containing surveillance photographs spanning 2 decades. Images of Patricia leaving work, shopping for groceries, attending church, and going about her daily life, all taken by people working for Robert's criminal network. "They've been watching her continuously for 20 years, Agent Rodriguez said, "making sure she stayed in Phoenix, that she didn't try to investigate Rebecca's death or search for you. The level of control my adoptive family had exercised over innocent people was staggering. They hadn't just stolen my life and killed my mother. They had terrorized my extended family for decades." Yesterday, after Morrison's arrest, Robert sent a message to his associates. Agent Rodriguez continued. "He wants them to eliminate Patricia as a potential witness before she can be contacted by federal agents." My blood ran cold as I processed this information. Patricia had spent 20 years living her life, never knowing that she was being watched by criminals who were prepared to kill her at any moment. "We have to protect her," I said. "We're already moving," Agent Rodriguez replied. "Teams are being deployed to Phoenix to bring Patricia into protective custody. But Robert's network includes people we haven't identified yet. Until we're certain Patricia is safe, we have to assume she's in immediate danger." Agent Rodriguez handed me a secure phone that would allow me to communicate with the Phoenix team. "We want you to be the one to contact Patricia and explain the situation. She's more likely to trust someone who's family than a federal agent she's never met." The weight of that responsibility was enormous. I was about to call a woman I had never met and tell her that her sister was murdered, that I was the daughter she thought was dead, and that her life was in danger because of crimes she knew nothing about. "What do I tell her about Rebecca?" I asked. Agent Rodriguez pulled out Rebecca's complete file, including medical records and personal belongings that had been collected as evidence. "Tell her the truth. Rebecca died fighting to find you and protect you. She never stopped loving you or trying to bring you home." I dialed the number with trembling fingers. Patricia answered on the second ring, her voice warm and professional. "Children's Hospital Phoenix Pediatric Unit, this is Patricia." "Patricia Morrison?" I asked, my voice catching on her last name. "Yes, can I help you?" "My name is Janet Stevens, but my birth name was Janet Lynn Morrison. I'm Rebecca's daughter." Silence stretched across the phone line for what felt like forever. When Patricia finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Janet, Rebecca's baby, but you died in the car accident with her." "No," I said gently. "I was adopted before Rebecca died. She was killed trying to find me." Patricia began crying, and I could hear her struggling to process information that contradicted everything she had believed for 20 years. "I need you to listen to me carefully," I continued. "You're in danger right now. Federal agents are coming to protect you, but you need to leave the hospital immediately and go to the main police station downtown." "I don't understand," Patricia said through her tears. "What's happening?" Over the next 10 minutes, I explained as much as I could about the criminal network Rebecca's murder and the surveillance Patricia had been under. Agent Rodriguez coached me through the conversation, making sure I provided enough information to convince Patricia to cooperate without overwhelming her. "The people who killed Rebecca have been watching you for 20 years, I explained. "They're planning to hurt you to prevent you from talking to federal agents about your sister's death." Patricia's voice became stronger as the immediate danger penetrated her shock. "I'm leaving the hospital right now. Janet, where have you been all this time? I looked for you after Rebecca died, but the police said there were no survivors." "I was adopted by the people who killed her." I said the words tasting like poison. "They raised me as their daughter while using me in their criminal operation." "Oh my God," Patricia whispered. "Rebecca never stopped talking about you. She was going to nursing school so she could provide a better life when she got you back." Agent Rodriguez handed me a note. "Tell her about the safety deposit box." "Patricia Rebecca left something for me in a safety deposit box. Do you know anything about that?" "Yes." Patricia's voice brightened with excitement. "She gave me a key years ago and told me to keep it safe. She said someday you might need what was inside." My heart raced as I realized Rebecca had planned for the possibility that something might happen to her before she could reunite with me. "Where is the safety deposit box?" I asked. "First National Bank in Phoenix," Patricia replied. "Rebecca said the box contained everything you would need to know about your real family and your inheritance." Inheritance? Rebecca had left me something beyond just personal mementos. Agent Rodriguez was making rapid notes and phone calls, coordinating with the Phoenix team to secure both Patricia and the safety deposit box before Robert's associates could interfere. "Janet," Patricia said, her voice full of emotion. "I've been waiting 20 years to meet you. Rebecca made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would take care of you and tell you how much she loved you." Tears were streaming down my face as I connected with the family I had never known existed. But Agent Rodriguez tapped her watch, reminding me that time was critical. "Patricia, the federal agents should be at the police station when you arrive. Ask for Agent Sarah Rodriguez and tell them you're Rebecca Morrison's sister. They'll take you somewhere safe until we can arrest the people who have been threatening you." "Will I get to see you?" Patricia asked. "Yes," I promised. "As soon as it's safe, I'm flying to Phoenix to meet you." After Patricia hung up, Agent Rodriguez updated me on the situation. "Phoenix team confirms Patricia has arrived safely at the police station. They're moving her to a secure location where Robert's associates can't find her." But even with Patricia in protective custody, the threat wasn't over. Robert's criminal network included people across multiple states, and federal agents were still working to identify all the participants. "We intercepted communications suggesting that Robert has ordered retaliation against you and Patricia," Agent Rodriguez said. "His associates believe that eliminating both of you will prevent federal agents from building a complete case against the network." The reality of the ongoing danger was sobering, but I felt something new stirring inside me. For the first time in my life, I had real family who cared about me, people who had been searching for me and hoping I was alive. "Agent Rodriguez," I said, "I want to go to Phoenix and help Patricia open that safety deposit box. Whatever Rebecca left for me might contain evidence that will help destroy Robert's network completely." She nodded grimly. "We were hoping you would say that. But Janet, this trip will be dangerous. Robert's associates know we're closing in and they're going to make desperate moves to protect themselves." "I understand the risk," I replied. "But Rebecca died trying to protect me and find me. The least I can do is finish what she started." Agent Rodriguez made arrangements for me to travel to Phoenix under federal protection. As I prepared for the trip, I thought about the aunt I had never met who'd been waiting 20 years to welcome me home. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt hope that something good might come from all the pain and betrayal. The flight to Phoenix felt surreal. I sat in first class surrounded by federal marshals who looked like ordinary business travelers, but I knew they were prepared to protect me with their lives. Agent Rodriguez sat across the aisle reviewing case files and coordinating with teams in multiple cities. When we landed, I was escorted through a private terminal where Agent Martinez from the Phoenix field office was waiting with updates on Patricia's situation. "She's doing well, all things considered," Agent Martinez reported. "She's been asking questions about you and your mother constantly. 20 years of not knowing what happened to her niece has been very difficult for her." Patricia was being held at a safe house in Scottsdale, surrounded by federal protection. Agent Martinez drove me there through winding residential streets while checking mirrors constantly for surveillance. The safe house looked like an ordinary suburban home, but I noticed security cameras and agents positioned strategically around the property. Inside, Patricia Morrison was waiting in a living room that felt warm and comfortable despite the circumstances. When I walked through the door, Patricia stood up from the couch and stared at me in amazement. She was smaller than I had expected, maybe 5 feet 4 inches tall, with graying dark hair and the same green eyes I saw in the mirror every day. "You look exactly like Rebecca," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Exactly like her. We embraced in the middle of that living room, and I felt a connection I had never experienced with Carol. This wasn't the conditional love I had grown up with. This was family in the truest sense of the word. "I have so much to tell you," Patricia said, leading me to the couch. "And I have something Rebecca left for you." She pulled out a small silver key attached to a chain around her neck. "She gave this to me when you were 5 years old. She said the safety deposit box contained everything you would need to know about your heritage and your father." My father. In all the chaos of the investigation, I had focused on Rebecca's murder and hadn't thought much about my biological father. "Is he still alive?" I asked. Patricia nodded, smiling through her tears. "David Morrison, Rebecca's brother. He's been looking for you since the day Rebecca died." The family connections were more complex than I had realized. David Morrison wasn't just my biological father, he was Patricia's brother and Rebecca's brother. My parents had been siblings. "Wait," I said, confused. "If David and Rebecca were both Morrisons and they were siblings, how could they be my parents?" Patricia laughed, wiping her eyes. "Oh, honey, no. David isn't Rebecca's brother. Morrison was Rebecca's married name. She married David when she was 16, right before you were born." Relief flooded through me as Patricia explained the family relationships. Rebecca Morrison had married David Morrison when she became pregnant with me. They shared a last name through marriage, not blood. "Where is David now?" I asked. "Denver," Patricia replied. "He moved there after Rebecca died, but he never remarried. He spent 20 years working as a contractor and saving money in case you were ever found." Agent Rodriguez had been listening to our conversation while coordinating with other federal teams. She looked up from her phone with an expression of concern. "We have a problem," she announced. "Robert's associates have located the bank where Rebecca's safety deposit box is stored. They're planning to break in tonight and destroy whatever evidence is inside." Patricia grabbed my hand. "We have to get there first." Agent Martinez was already making phone calls to coordinate security at the bank. The Phoenix Police Department is providing additional protection, and we have teams positioned around the building, but we need to access that safety deposit box immediately. 30 minutes later, our convoy arrived at First National Bank of Phoenix. Federal agents had cleared the building of other customers, and bank officials were waiting to assist us with accessing Rebecca's safety deposit box. The bank manager, Mrs. Chen, led us to the vault area where hundreds of metal boxes lined the walls. Patricia's key opened box number 1247, and inside was a metal container about the size of a shoebox. "Rebecca told me never to open this," Patricia said as she lifted the container out. "She said only you should see what's inside." I opened the metal box with trembling hands, and inside were documents and photographs that would change my understanding of everything. Letters. Dozens of handwritten letters from Rebecca to me, documenting her life from the time I was placed for adoption until just days before her death. My dearest Janet. The first letter began, "If you're reading this, it means I found you again, or something happened to me while I was searching. Either way, I want you to know that not a single day has passed that I haven't thought about you and loved you." The letters detailed Rebecca's struggle with addiction during her teenage years, her decision to place me for adoption to give me a better life, and her eventual recovery and determination to reunite with me. But there was more in the box. Financial documents showing that Rebecca had been working 3 jobs and saving every penny to prepare for my return. Bank statements revealed that she had accumulated over $50,000 in a trust fund designated for my education and future. "She wanted to make sure you could go to college," Patricia explained. "She was planning to contact you when the trust fund reached $100,000. The final item in the box was a manila envelope labeled, "For law enforcement, evidence of criminal activity." Inside were photographs, documents, and audio recordings that made Agent Rodriguez's eyes widen with excitement. Rebecca was conducting her own investigation, Agent Rodriguez said, examining the materials. She had been documenting Robert Stevens' criminal activities for 2 years before her death. Rebecca had somehow discovered that the family who adopted me was involved in counterfeiting and document fraud. Her evidence included surveillance photographs of the warehouse license plate numbers of vehicles used by Robert's associates, and even audio recordings of conversations about the criminal operation. "How did she get this information?" I asked. Patricia pulled out a letter addressed to me in Rebecca's handwriting. "She had hired a private investigator to find you. When the investigator started asking questions about your adoption, he uncovered evidence of Robert's criminal network." The letter explained that Rebecca had been preparing to contact law enforcement about the adoption fraud when she was killed. She had hidden the evidence in the safety deposit box as insurance, hoping that someday someone would find it and bring justice. "She knew she was in danger," Agent Rodriguez observed, reading through Rebecca's notes. "These documents show she was aware that her investigation had been discovered." Rebecca's final letter to me was dated just 3 days before her death. "My beautiful daughter, if something happens to me before I can bring you home, please know that I died fighting for you. The people who took you are dangerous criminals who have hurt many children. Don't let my death be meaningless. Use this evidence to stop them and save other children from the fate they planned for you. I love you more than words can express, and I believe someday we will be together again. Your mother, Rebecca." Reading those words, I felt a sense of purpose and determination that went beyond my own situation. Rebecca had died trying to protect me and expose the network that was exploiting children. Her evidence could help federal prosecutors build an even stronger case and ensure that Robert's entire operation was destroyed. "Agent Rodriguez," I said, holding Rebecca's letter. "This evidence proves that Robert knew his adoption of me was illegal and that he killed Rebecca to cover it up. This isn't just about counterfeiting anymore. This is about premeditated murder and child trafficking." She nodded grimly. "With this evidence, we can charge Robert with first-degree murder and seek the death penalty." As we prepared to leave the bank with Rebecca's evidence, Agent Martinez received an urgent phone call. His expression grew dark as he listened, and when he hung up, he turned to us with alarming news. "David Morrison is missing," he announced. "He was supposed to meet with Denver agents this morning, but he never showed up. His apartment shows signs of a struggle." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Robert's associates had found my biological father and taken him probably as leverage to force me to stop cooperating with federal agents. "They're using him as a bargaining chip," Agent Rodriguez said. "Robert knows we have enough evidence to convict him, so he's trying to negotiate by threatening the people you care about." Patricia grabbed my arm, her face pale with terror. "What if they kill him like they killed Rebecca?" Agent Martinez was already coordinating search efforts with Denver teams, but finding David would be extremely difficult if Robert's associates had moved him out of the state. "We're going to find him," Agent Rodriguez promised. "But first, we need to get you both to safety. Robert's network is more desperate and dangerous than we initially realized. As federal agents escorted us out of the bank, I clutched Rebecca's evidence and thought about the biological father I had never met. Somewhere David Morrison was being held by criminals who had already murdered his wife and stolen his daughter. But thanks to Rebecca's courage and foresight, we now had the evidence needed to destroy Robert's network completely. The question was whether we could find David before Robert's desperation led to another murder. The drive back to the safe house felt tense as Agent Rodriguez coordinated search efforts for David, while Patricia and I processed the emotional weight of Rebecca's evidence. The letters my biological mother had written revealed a woman of incredible strength who had transformed her life in hopes of reuniting with her daughter. Rebecca talked about David constantly, Patricia said as we sat in the secure living room. She blamed herself for what happened to your family. She thought if she had been stronger, if she hadn't struggled with addiction, none of this would have happened. I was reading through Rebecca's journal entries which documented her recovery process and her growing determination to expose the adoption fraud. Her handwriting grew more confident as the entries progressed, showing a woman who was reclaiming her power and fighting for justice. She was incredibly brave, I said, looking at surveillance photographs Rebecca had taken of Robert's warehouse. She was investigating dangerous criminals with no law enforcement training or protection. Agent Rodriguez received updates from Denver every 30 minutes, but the news about David remained grim. His apartment had been ransacked, and neighbors reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles in the area the day before his disappearance. "We're analyzing security camera footage from the surrounding area," she reported. But Robert's associates have had decades to perfect their kidnapping and transportation methods. Patricia pulled out her phone and showed me photographs she had taken over the years. Pictures of David at family gatherings, working on construction projects, and volunteering at local charities. "He never gave up hope that you were alive," she said. "Every year on your birthday, he would put money into a savings account and say it was for when you came home." The idea that my biological father had been honoring my birthday for 25 years while I celebrated with the people who killed my mother was almost too painful to bear. Agent Martinez entered the living room with his phone pressed to his ear. After a brief conversation, he hung up and turned to us with cautious optimism. "Denver teams found something," he announced. David left a message. He showed us a photograph from David's apartment. Hidden under his mattress, investigators had found a note addressed to, "My daughter Janet if something happens to me." He was prepared for the possibility that Robert's people would find him, Agent Martinez explained. The note contains information about additional evidence he's been collecting. David's message revealed that he had been conducting his own investigation parallel to Rebecca's efforts. After her death, he had continued gathering evidence about the adoption fraud and Robert's criminal network. He hid evidence in 3 different locations around Denver. Agent Rodriguez said, reading from David's note, "Bank safe deposit boxes, a storage unit, and with a trusted friend who doesn't know what the materials contain." The scope of evidence against Robert was expanding beyond what federal agents had initially discovered. Between Rebecca's investigation, David's research, and the materials found at Robert's warehouse, prosecutors would have an overwhelming case. David's note also contains a warning. Agent Martinez continued. He believed Robert's associates were planning to eliminate all potential witnesses, including extended family members. That meant Patricia and I would remain targets until Robert's entire network was dismantled. The criminal operation that had controlled my life for 25 years wasn't going to disappear quietly. My phone rang with a call from an unknown number. Agent Rodriguez motioned for me to answer while she activated recording equipment. "Janet." The voice was David's, but he sounded strained and frightened. "David, where are you? Are you okay?" "I'm alive, but I'm being held by some very dangerous people," he said quickly. "They want you to stop cooperating with federal agents and destroy any evidence you've found." Agent Rodriguez was frantically making hand signals while other agents traced the call. "They say if you don't comply within 24 hours, they'll kill me the same way they killed Rebecca," David continued. "Janet, I need you to know something important about your mother's death." "What about it?" I asked, my heart pounding. "She didn't die in a car accident," David said, his voice breaking. "She was murdered, and I have proof." Agent Rodriguez's eyes widened as David continued. "I was there that night," he whispered. "I followed Rebecca because I was worried about her meeting with the private investigator. I saw Detective Morrison force her car off the road." The confession was devastating. David had witnessed his wife's murder but had been powerless to stop it or seek justice through official channels because the killer was a police officer. "I've been gathering evidence for 20 years, David continued. "Video footage, witness statements, financial records connecting Morrison to Robert's operation. Everything you need to prove Rebecca was murdered." Agent Rodriguez was writing rapid notes and coordinating with Denver teams to triangulate the phone call's location. "David, where are you being held?" I asked. "I don't know exactly, but I can hear airport noise, planes taking off and landing, and there's a chemical smell like industrial solvents." Agent Martinez recognized the description immediately. "Denver International Airport Industrial Area," he said. "There are chemical processing facilities near the runways." Federal agents were already mobilizing toward that location, but David's captors were clearly monitoring the call. "I have to go," David said urgently. "Janet, your mother loved you more than life itself. Don't let her sacrifice be meaningless. Stop these people no matter what happens to me." The line went dead, leaving us in tense silence. Agent Rodriguez was coordinating rescue efforts while I processed the knowledge that my biological father had witnessed my mother's murder and spent 2 decades seeking justice. "We're going to get him back," Patricia said, gripping my hand. "David is tougher than he looks. He survived losing Rebecca, and he'll survive this." Agent Rodriguez looked up from her phone with urgent intensity. "Denver teams are moving on 3 locations near the airport, but we need to assume Robert's associates are prepared to kill David if they realize law enforcement is closing in." The next 2 hours were the longest of my life. We sat in that safe house waiting for updates while federal agents conducted a coordinated rescue operation 2 states away. Every phone call could bring news of David's freedom or his death. Finally, Agent Rodriguez's phone rang with the call we had been waiting for. "We have him," she announced with relief. "David Morrison is alive and in federal custody. 2 arrests at the airport location, and we recovered additional evidence that David had hidden on his person." I broke down crying with relief and exhaustion. The man I had never met but who had spent 20 years fighting for justice for my mother was finally safe. "David wants to talk to you," Agent Rodriguez said, handing me her secure phone. "Janet," David's voice sounded tired but strong. "I'm here," I said through my tears. "Are you hurt?" "Nothing serious," he replied. "But sweetheart, we have work to do. The evidence I've been collecting all these years is going to put Robert and his entire network away forever." As I spoke with my biological father for the first time surrounded by federal agents and my Aunt Patricia, I felt a sense of family and purpose that had been missing my entire life. Robert Stevens had stolen 25 years from me, but he hadn't been able to destroy the love and determination of my real family. Rebecca, David, and Patricia had spent decades fighting to bring me home and seek justice for the crimes committed against our family. Now it was time to finish what they had started. 3 days later, I stood in the Phoenix airport watching passengers emerge from the Denver flight. Agent Martinez had coordinated David's travel with maximum security, and I could see federal marshals positioned throughout the terminal. When David Morrison walked through the gate, I recognized him immediately despite never having seen his photograph. He was tall and lean, with graying dark hair and the same green eyes that ran through our family. But it was something deeper that made me know him instantly. The way he carried himself, the determined expression on his face, and the careful way he scanned the crowd reminded me of the woman I had seen in Rebecca's photographs. "Janet," he said simply as he approached, his voice full of 28 years of hope and longing. We embraced in the middle of that busy airport, and I felt a connection that went beyond genetics. This was the man who had loved my mother enough to spend 2 decades seeking justice for her murder. The man who had never stopped believing I was alive and would someday come home. "You look so much like her," David whispered, holding me tightly. "So much like Rebecca." Patricia joined our reunion, and for the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who shared my DNA and my history. People who remembered the woman who gave birth to me and loved me enough to die protecting me. The drive to the safe house gave David and me time to begin processing 28 years of separation. He told me about his life after Rebecca's death, the jobs he had taken to support his investigation, and the countless nights he had spent researching adoption fraud and criminal networks. "I always knew Rebecca didn't die in an accident," he said as we sat in the secure living room. "She was the most careful driver I knew, and the weather was clear that night. But Detective Morrison convinced everyone it was just a tragic accident, and I had no proof otherwise." David pulled out a worn leather portfolio containing documents he had carried with him during his kidnapping. "I've been building a case against Morrison and Robert Stevens for 20 years. Financial records, witness statements, surveillance footage, everything we need to prove they murdered Rebecca." Agent Rodriguez examined the materials with growing excitement. "This evidence fills in gaps we've been trying to close for months. David, how did you manage to gather all this without being detected?" "I learned to be invisible," David replied. "I worked construction jobs that gave me access to buildings and areas where Robert's associates conducted business. I photographed meetings, recorded conversations, and documented financial transactions." The portfolio contained hundreds of photographs showing Robert Detective Morrison and various associates conducting what appeared to be criminal business. Time-stamped images spanning 2 decades proved the conspiracy had been operating continuously since Rebecca's death. "But this is the most important evidence," David said, pulling out a small recording device. Audio from the night Rebecca was murdered. He explained that he had been following Rebecca that night because he was worried about her meeting with the private investigator. When Detective Morrison forced her off the road, David had hidden nearby and recorded the aftermath. Morrison called Robert immediately after the crash. David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I have their entire conversation on tape." Agent Rodriguez played the recording, and we listened in horrified silence as Detective Morrison reported Rebecca's death to Robert Stevens. "It's done," Morrison's voice said through the old recording. "The Morrison woman won't be asking any more questions about the kid." "Good," Robert replied. "Make sure the accident scene looks convincing. We can't have anyone investigating the adoption records." The cold, businesslike discussion of my mother's murder was sickening. These men had killed a young woman who was fighting to reunite with her daughter, and they had talked about it like completing a routine business transaction. "Why didn't you take this to the FBI years ago?" Agent Rodriguez asked. David's expression grew dark. "I tried. In 1997, I contacted the Denver field office with evidence of Morrison's corruption. 2 weeks later, my apartment was broken into and my evidence was stolen. I realized the corruption went deeper than just Detective Morrison. He had spent the next 20 years being more careful, gathering evidence slowly and hiding it in multiple locations. The kidnapping had occurred because Robert's associates finally discovered the scope of David's investigation. They were planning to kill me and make it look like suicide," David explained. "But they wanted to use my death to manipulate you into stopping your cooperation with federal agents." The revelation that my biological father had come close to being murdered because of his dedication to seeking justice for my mother was overwhelming. This man had risked everything to hold my adoptive family accountable for their crimes. "David," I said, "I want to help finish what you and Rebecca started. These people destroyed our family, but they're not going to destroy any more children." He smiled for the first time since arriving in Phoenix. "That's exactly what your mother would have said." Over the next several hours, David shared stories about Rebecca that painted a picture of the woman I had lost. She'd been studying to become a nurse, volunteering at a local shelter for homeless teenagers, and planning to open a daycare center for working mothers. "Rebecca had so many dreams." David said, showing me letters she had written about her plans for our future. She wanted to give you everything she never had: a stable home, educational opportunities, and a family that would never abandon you. The contrast between Rebecca's dreams and the reality of my life with Robert and Carol was heartbreaking. Instead of a loving family, I had been raised by criminals who used me as a tool in their illegal operation. But she also prepared for the possibility that something might happen to her, David continued. Rebecca set up trust funds, gathered evidence, and made arrangements to ensure you would be protected, even if she wasn't there to do it herself. Patricia pulled out additional documents that revealed the full extent of Rebecca's planning. Beyond the $50,000 in the safety deposit box, Rebecca had established a second trust fund that had been growing for 28 years. She left instructions that if anything happened to her, the money should continue accumulating until you turned 30. Patricia explained. The fund now contains over $200,000. The financial security Rebecca had tried to provide was significant, but the emotional inheritance was even more valuable. Through her letters, evidence gathering, and careful planning, she had left me the tools needed to seek justice and build a meaningful life. There's something else, David said quietly. Rebecca was pregnant when she died. The room fell silent as the full tragedy of that night became clear. Robert and Detective Morrison hadn't just murdered my mother. They had killed my unborn sibling and destroyed the family Rebecca was fighting to rebuild. She was going to tell me about the pregnancy after she finished dealing with the adoption investigation. David continued. She wanted to make sure you were safe before we started planning for another child. The knowledge that I had lost a brother or sister in addition to my mother filled me with a rage I had never experienced before. Robert Stevens hadn't just stolen my childhood, he had murdered my entire family to protect his criminal operation. Agent Rodriguez. I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. I want to testify against Robert personally. I want him to hear directly from the daughter of the woman he murdered exactly what he took from our family. She nodded with respect and determination. Janet, with the evidence you, David, and Patricia have provided, we're going to ensure that Robert Stevens faces justice for every crime he committed. As I sat in that safe house surrounded by my real family, I felt a sense of purpose that went beyond personal revenge. Rebecca had died fighting to protect children from exploitation. David had spent 20 years gathering evidence to expose corruption and criminality. Patricia had preserved the truth about our family history despite decades of threats and intimidation. Now it was my turn to carry their fight forward and ensure that Robert's network was completely destroyed. The little girl who had been stolen from her family 25 years ago was finally ready to go home. Agent Rodriguez gathered our group around a conference table that had been set up in the safe house. Maps, photographs, and organizational charts covered every surface as she outlined the most complex federal operation I had ever seen. Robert's network spans 14 states and includes over 300 active participants. She began. Tomorrow we're conducting simultaneous arrests in 47 locations to prevent anyone from escaping or destroying evidence. The scope of the operation was staggering. FBI field offices, DEA task forces, ATF agents, and local police departments were coordinating to dismantle what had become one of the largest criminal enterprises in American history. Janet, your role is critical to the operation's success, Agent Rodriguez continued. We need you to make contact with Robert in federal custody and get him to reveal the locations of hidden evidence and the identities of participants we haven't identified yet. The plan required me to visit Robert in jail and pretend that I was willing to cooperate with his demands. While wearing recording devices, I would encourage him to discuss details of the operation that federal agents could use to locate additional evidence. He's going to try to manipulate you, Agent Rodriguez warned. Robert is a master at psychological control, and he'll use every technique he's learned over 25 years to make you doubt yourself and feel guilty for cooperating with law enforcement. David leaned forward with concern. Is it safe for Janet to be alone with him? Robert is desperate now, and desperate criminals are unpredictable. She won't be alone, Agent Rodriguez assured him. We'll have agents monitoring the conversation, and Janet will be equipped with panic devices that will bring immediate assistance if needed. Patricia studied the operational timeline with anxiety. What if Robert realizes this is a setup? What if he warns his associates before you can arrest them? That's a risk we have to take, Agent Rodriguez replied. But Robert's arrogance works in our favor. He believes he's smarter than law enforcement, and he thinks he can still manipulate Janet into protecting him. The psychological profile federal agents had developed showed Robert as a narcissistic criminal who genuinely believed he deserved credit for his intelligence and planning. That arrogance had led him to document his crimes extensively, and it might lead him to reveal information during our conversation. I can do this, I said, surprising myself with how confident I sounded. Robert spent 25 years conditioning me to respond to his manipulation, but I understand his techniques now. I can use that knowledge against him. Agent Martinez handed me a folder containing talking points and questions designed to elicit specific information from Robert. We need details about offshore accounts, international contacts, and contingency plans for escaping prosecution. The folder also contains psychological strategies for resisting Robert's manipulation attempts, techniques for staying focused on the mission while appearing vulnerable to his influence. Remember, Agent Rodriguez said, Robert believes you're the scared, confused young woman he raised. He doesn't know you've connected with your biological family and learned the truth about Rebecca's murder. Use that ignorance against him. As we prepared for the prison visit, David pulled me aside with fatherly concern. Janet, you don't have to do this, he said. You've already provided more help than anyone could expect. Federal agents can build their case without putting you at additional risk. David, Robert killed my mother and stole my entire life, I replied. I need to look him in the eye and know that he understands exactly who defeated him. Patricia joined our conversation with her own perspective. Rebecca would be proud of your courage, but she would also want you to be safe. Don't take unnecessary risks to prove something to people who never deserved your love. Their concern was touching, but I felt a clarity of purpose that surprised me. For 28 years, I had been reacting to other people's choices and manipulation. This was the first time I had the opportunity to take control of my own story and actively seek justice. The next morning, I dressed in clothing that would remind Robert of the compliant daughter he had raised. Conservative business attire, minimal makeup, and the nervous demeanor I had perfected during years of trying to please him. Agent Rodriguez drove me to the federal detention center while reviewing last-minute details of the operation. Teams are positioned at all target locations, she reported. As soon as Robert provides the information we need, arrests will begin simultaneously across 14 states. The weight of responsibility was enormous. Hundreds of law enforcement officers were waiting for the intelligence I was supposed to gather from Robert. Dozens of victims were depending on this operation to find justice and safety. The Federal Detention Center was the imposing concrete building surrounded by razor wire and guard towers. Inside, I was processed through multiple security checkpoints before being escorted to a small conference room with cameras and recording equipment. Robert was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. He looked older than I remembered, with gray stubble and tired eyes, but his expression was still calculating and manipulative. Janet, sweetheart, he said as guards secured his handcuffs to the table. I'm so glad you came to see me. Hi, Dad, I replied, using the word that felt like poison but was necessary for the operation. For the next 90 minutes, Robert attempted every manipulation technique he had used throughout my childhood. Guilt about abandoning the family that raised me. Fear about what would happen to me if his criminal network was completely exposed. False concern about my emotional well-being and financial security. You have to understand everything we did was to protect you, he said with practiced sincerity. The adoption, the business arrangements, even the situation with your biological mother. We were trying to give you opportunities you never would have had otherwise. I nodded and played the role of the confused, guilt-ridden daughter, while Robert revealed details about offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, contact information for associates in Canada and Mexico, and contingency plans for relocating the operation to South America. "There's something you need to know about your biological father," Robert said, his voice taking on a more threatening tone. "David Morrison has been interfering with our family for 20 years. He's not the innocent victim federal agents want you to believe he is." Robert's attempt to turn me against David revealed just how desperate he had become. Even facing federal charges and life in prison, he was still trying to isolate me from people who genuinely cared about me. "What about David?" I asked, maintaining my role. "He's been blackmailing our family since Rebecca's death." Robert lied smoothly, demanding money in exchange for keeping quiet about business arrangements. The evidence he claims to have against us was obtained through extortion and illegal surveillance. The accusation was so outrageous that I had to focus on maintaining my expression of confusion rather than letting my anger show. "Are you saying David has been lying to federal agents?" I asked. "I'm saying David Morrison is not the grieving widower he pretends to be," Robert replied. "He's a career criminal who saw an opportunity to profit from his wife's death." Robert's willingness to lie about David's character while facing overwhelming evidence of his own crimes demonstrated just how thoroughly manipulative he truly was. Even in federal custody, he was still trying to control my perception of reality. "Dad, I'm scared," I said, allowing genuine emotion to creep into my voice. "I don't know who to trust anymore." Robert's expression softened as he recognized what he thought was an opportunity to regain control over me. "Trust me, sweetheart," he said. "I'm the only family you've ever really had. David and Patricia are strangers who want to use you for their own purposes. But I've loved you and protected you since you were 3 years old." "What should I do?" I asked. Robert leaned forward as much as his handcuffs would allow. "There are safe deposit boxes and storage facilities that federal agents haven't found yet. If you can access those locations and destroy the evidence inside, we can make this whole nightmare go away." He was asking me to obstruct a federal investigation and destroy evidence of crimes spanning 3 decades. The request confirmed that Robert still saw me as a tool he could manipulate, rather than a person with my own moral agency. "Where are these locations?" I asked. Robert provided addresses for storage facilities in Nevada and California, account information for banks in offshore jurisdictions, and contact details for associates who were prepared to help me flee the country if necessary. As he revealed information that would allow federal agents to complete their case against his entire network, Robert genuinely believed he was recruiting me back into his criminal enterprise. "Janet," he said as our time ran out, "you're my daughter in every way that matters. Don't let strangers convince you to destroy the family that raised you." Guards came to escort Robert back to his cell, and he looked at me with what appeared to be genuine paternal affection. Even facing life in prison, he still believed he had successfully manipulated me into helping him escape justice. As I left the detention center, Agent Rodriguez was waiting with updates from field teams across the country. "We have everything we need," she said with satisfaction. "Operation Family Reunion begins now." 6 hours after my meeting with Robert, federal agents were simultaneously breaching 47 locations across 14 states. I sat in the Phoenix field office watching live feeds from operations in Los Angeles, Chicago, Denver, and Atlanta, while Agent Rodriguez coordinated the largest financial crime takedown in FBI history. "Nevada storage facilities secured," came the report from Las Vegas. "Massive evidence recovery in progress." "California bank accounts frozen," reported the San Francisco team. "International wire transfers blocked." 12 arrests in Chicago, no resistance encountered. The reports kept coming as Robert's network collapsed systematically. Decades of criminal enterprise were being dismantled in a matter of hours, all because Robert's arrogance had led him to reveal operational details he thought I would use to help him. Janet, Agent Rodriguez said, "There's something you need to see." She led me to a conference room where evidence from the Nevada storage facility was being cataloged. Boxes of documents, computer equipment, and financial records filled the entire space, but Agent Rodriguez directed my attention to a specific collection of materials. Personal items belonging to Rebecca, jewelry, photographs, letters, and mementos that Robert had kept as trophies after murdering my mother. He's been collecting souvenirs from his victims for 30 years, Agent Rodriguez explained. Rebecca's items were mixed in with belongings from at least 12 other people who were killed because they threatened his operation. Among Rebecca's possessions was a silver locket containing a photograph of me as a baby. A woman I had never known had worn my picture close to her heart while fighting to bring me home. "There's more," Agent Rodriguez said quietly. "We found evidence that Robert was planning to kill you during your prison visit today." She showed me communications between Robert and an associate who had been positioned outside the detention center. If I had agreed to help Robert destroy evidence, his plan was to eliminate me as soon as I was no longer useful to him. "Your biological father was right to be concerned about your safety," Agent Rodriguez continued. "Robert never intended for you to survive this investigation." The realization that I had been minutes away from assassination was sobering, but it also confirmed that stopping Robert's network was about more than seeking justice for past crimes. It was about preventing future murders and protecting other potential victims. My phone rang with a call from David. "Janet, are you safe? Patricia and I have been watching news reports about mass arrests." "I'm fine," I assured him. "It's over. Robert's entire network is being destroyed as we speak." "What about Madison?" David asked. "Has she been found?" Agent Rodriguez shook her head grimly. Madison remained the one major threat that hadn't been neutralized. She had escaped the initial arrests and was believed to be fleeing toward the Canadian border with significant cash reserves and false identification documents. "We have teams monitoring border crossings and airports," Agent Rodriguez said. But Madison had years to prepare escape routes and establish safe houses. The possibility that Madison might escape justice was frustrating, but the scope of the overall operation's success was undeniable. Over 200 arrests had been made, millions of dollars in assets had been frozen, and evidence had been recovered that would support prosecutions for decades to come. "Agent Rodriguez," I said, "I want to see the warehouse where Madison was recruiting children." She looked surprised by my request. "The facility is still an active crime scene. Why do you want to go there?" "Because I need to understand how many children were victimized by this operation," I replied, "and I want to see the place where it all happened with my own eyes." An hour later, we arrived at the industrial warehouse where Madison had been training teenage recruits for criminal activities. Federal agents had transformed the space into an evidence processing center, but I could still see the areas where children had been taught to forge documents and handle counterfeit currency. "We've identified 67 minors who were involved with the operation over the past 5 years," Agent Rodriguez said as we toured the facility. "Most of them are between 14 and 17 years old." Computer equipment in Madison's office contained detailed psychological profiles of each child, including information about family situations, emotional vulnerabilities, and criminal potential. Madison had been studying these teenagers like laboratory subjects, determining how to best exploit their desperation and need for belonging. "What happens to these kids now?" I asked. "Social Services is working with each family to provide counseling and support," Agent Rodriguez replied. "Many of these children were victims themselves, manipulated into criminal activity by adults they trusted." In Madison's private office, agents had discovered something that made my blood run cold: a detailed plan for expanding the operation by establishing recruitment centers in other cities, specifically targeting foster care systems and homeless youth programs. Madison was planning to franchise this operation, Agent Rodriguez explained. She was developing a systematic approach to child exploitation that could be implemented anywhere in the country. The scope of Madison's ambitions was staggering. She hadn't been content with the existing criminal enterprise. She had been planning to scale it nationally and create an industrial approach to victimizing children. Among Madison's planning documents was a psychological analysis of me detailing my personality motivations and potential usefulness to the expanded operation. Madison had been studying me for years, determining how to manipulate me more effectively and use my legitimate banking career to support larger criminal activities. She saw you as the key to legitimizing their operation, Agent Rodriguez observed. Your position at the bank and clean legal record made you valuable for activities that required someone with credible credentials. Reading Madison's cold clinical assessment of my psychology was deeply disturbing, but it also revealed something important about her mindset. Madison genuinely viewed other people as tools to be manipulated rather than human beings deserving of respect and consideration. As we finished touring the warehouse, Agent Martinez approached with urgent news. "We found Madison," he announced, "but there's a problem." Madison had been located at a private airfield in Montana, attempting to board a small aircraft bound for Canada. But when federal agents moved to arrest her, she'd taken the pilot hostage and barricaded herself inside the aircraft. "She's demanding to speak with Janet," Agent Martinez continued. "She says she has information about other victims that she'll only reveal in exchange for safe passage out of the country." The standoff had been ongoing for 2 hours and negotiators were making little progress. Madison knew she was facing life in prison and was desperate enough to take extreme measures to avoid capture. "I want to talk to her," I said. Agent Rodriguez immediately objected. "Too dangerous. Madison is unstable and has nothing to lose. She might try to hurt you out of spite or attempt to take you hostage as well." "She's not going to hurt me," I replied. "Madison needs me to believe her manipulation attempts. If I'm in physical danger, she loses her psychological leverage." Agent Martinez was coordinating with Montana teams to establish communication with Madison. She's specifically requested a video call with Janet. No other negotiator has been able to make progress. Against Agent Rodriguez's better judgment, I found myself sitting in front of a computer screen, preparing to negotiate with the woman who had pretended to be my sister for 25 years while planning to destroy my life. When Madison's face appeared on the screen, she looked haggard and desperate. Her blonde hair was disheveled, and her eyes showed the strain of someone who knew their criminal empire was collapsing around them. "Hello, sister," she said with bitter sarcasm. "Madison," I replied calmly. "Let the pilot go. He's not involved in this situation." "The pilot is my insurance policy," Madison replied, "just like you were Robert's insurance policy all these years." Her admission that I had been treated as an expendable asset rather than a family member was confirmation of everything I had learned during the investigation. "What information do you have about other victims?" I asked, focusing on the reason for her contact request. Madison's expression became calculating. "There are other children, Janet. Kids who are still being held at locations federal agents haven't found yet. If you want to save them, you need to help me escape." The possibility that children were still in danger made my stomach clench with anxiety, but Agent Rodriguez was shaking her head and holding up notes indicating that all known operational locations had already been secured. "Madison, every location connected to your operation has been raided," I said. "There are no children who haven't been recovered." "You're wrong," Madison insisted. "There are safe houses and training facilities that Robert never told you about. Places where we keep children who are being prepared for international operations." Agent Rodriguez was making rapid phone calls to verify whether any locations had been missed during the coordinated arrests. The possibility that children were still being victimized somewhere was too important to ignore, even if it meant dealing with Madison's manipulation attempts. "Tell me where these locations are," I said to Madison. "You don't need safe passage out of the country to protect children." Madison laughed bitterly. Janet, you're still so naive. You think this is about protecting children. This was always about money and power. The children were just a renewable resource. Her casual dismissal of human suffering revealed the depth of Madison's moral corruption. She genuinely viewed child victims as business assets rather than people deserving protection and care. If there are children still in danger, tell me where they are, I repeated. Madison's expression shifted to something approaching genuine emotion. There's one place, she said quietly, a facility in rural Oregon where Robert sends children who are too traumatized or difficult to use in normal operations. Agent Rodriguez was frantically coordinating with Oregon field teams while I continued the conversation. What happens to children at this facility? I asked. They disappear, Madison said simply. Children who can't be controlled or who might expose the operation are eliminated there. The implication that Robert had been systematically murdering child victims was horrifying, but consistent with his willingness to kill Rebecca and plan my own assassination. Give me the address, and I said. Madison provided coordinates for a property in the Cascade Mountains that didn't appear on any of the seized documents or computer records. If children were still being held there, they would need immediate rescue. Now help me get out of here, Madison demanded. No, I replied firmly. You've provided the information needed to save those children. You don't get to negotiate for freedom after participating in their abuse. Madison's face contorted with rage as she realized I wasn't going to help her escape justice. You have no idea what you've done, she screamed. Robert protected you for 25 years, and now you're going to destroy the only family you've ever had. Robert wasn't my family, I said calmly. He was my kidnapper. The video call ended as federal agents in Montana breached the aircraft and took Madison into custody. The pilot was rescued unharmed, and the last major participant in Robert's network was finally in federal custody. But our attention immediately shifted to Oregon, where teams were racing to locate the facility Madison had described. If children were still being held there, every minute of delay could mean the difference between rescue and tragedy. The Oregon facility was worse than anything I had imagined. Federal agents found 11 children between the ages of 8 and 16 being held in conditions that could only be described as a prison camp. The children were malnourished, traumatized, and had been systematically abused by Robert's associates for months or years. These children were being held as punishment for attempting to escape or report the operation to authorities, Agent Rodriguez explained as medical teams evacuated the victims. Madison's information likely saved their lives. The rescue operation became national news, and the full scope of Robert's criminal network was finally exposed to the public. Media outlets reported on the largest child trafficking investigation in American history, the murder of Rebecca Morrison and the systematic exploitation of hundreds of vulnerable young people. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courthouse watching as Robert Stevens was sentenced for his crimes. The proceedings had taken weeks with testimony from dozens of victims and expert witnesses who explained the psychological manipulation techniques Robert had used to control his criminal organization. The defendant has shown no remorse for his actions. Judge Patricia Williams said during the sentencing hearing, "Over 3 decades, Robert Stevens created a criminal enterprise that destroyed families, exploited children, and corrupted law enforcement officials. Robert maintained his arrogant demeanor throughout the trial, genuinely believing that his intelligence and planning deserved recognition rather than condemnation. Even facing multiple life sentences, he showed no understanding that his victims were real people rather than tools for his personal enrichment. For the murders of Rebecca Morrison and her unborn child," Judge Williams continued, "the defendant is sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Additional sentences for counterfeiting, child trafficking, money laundering, and racketeering ensured that Robert would never again be free to harm innocent people." Detective Morrison received a 25-year sentence after pleading guilty to murder, corruption, and conspiracy charges. His cooperation with prosecutors helped secure convictions against other corrupt law enforcement officials who had protected Robert's operation. Madison's trial was equally satisfying to witness. Despite her cooperation in locating the Oregon facility, her active participation in recruiting and abusing children resulted in a 30-year federal sentence. Madison Stevens showed a complete lack of empathy for her victims, Judge Williams said during Madison's sentencing. Her systematic exploitation of vulnerable children represents the worst kind of criminal behavior. Carol received 15 years in federal prison after accepting a plea agreement in exchange for testifying against Robert's associates. Her testimony helped prosecutors understand the full scope of the money laundering operation and locate additional hidden assets. But the most meaningful moment of the entire legal process came when I was allowed to deliver a victim impact statement directly to Robert. Robert Stevens. I began looking directly at the man who had stolen my childhood. You murdered my mother because she loved me enough to fight for my freedom. You stole 28 years of my life because you needed a child you could mold into the perfect victim. Robert stared at me with the same calculating expression he had used throughout my childhood, as if he were still trying to determine how to manipulate me. You thought you understood me because you had controlled me since I was 3 years old. I continued, but you never understood that the love my real family had for me was stronger than your manipulation and abuse. I pulled out a photograph of Rebecca that I had found among her possessions in the Nevada storage facility. This is Rebecca Morrison, the woman you murdered, I said, holding up the picture. She was studying to become a nurse. She volunteered at homeless shelters. She was planning to open a daycare center for working mothers. She had dreams and plans and people who loved her. Robert's expression didn't change, but I could see other people in the courtroom were moved by my description of the woman whose life he had ended. Rebecca died fighting to protect me and expose your criminal operation, I concluded. Her death wasn't meaningless because it led to your capture and the rescue of hundreds of other victims. You may have stolen my childhood, but you didn't destroy my capacity to seek justice and build a meaningful life. As I returned to my seat, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. For 28 years, Robert had controlled my perception of reality and my understanding of my own identity. But standing in that courtroom, speaking truth to power, I finally felt free of his psychological manipulation. The financial aspects of justice were equally satisfying. Federal prosecutors recovered over $40 million in assets from Robert's criminal enterprise money that was distributed among victims and their families. David and I established the Rebecca Morrison Foundation using recovered funds and insurance settlements from Robert's criminal activities. The foundation provides support for adoptees who have been exploited, assistance for families affected by child trafficking, and resources for investigating adoption fraud. Rebecca would be proud of what you've built, David told me as we toured the foundation's new office space in Denver. She always believed that something good could come from even the worst situations. The foundation had already helped reunite 12 families affected by illegal adoptions and provided counseling services for over 200 victims of child trafficking operations. Patricia joined the foundation's board of directors and used her nursing experience to develop trauma-informed care programs for rescued children. Her decades of waiting and hoping had been transformed into practical action to help other families find healing. I spent 20 years wondering what happened to you, Patricia said during the foundation's first annual board meeting. Now I get to spend the rest of my life helping other families avoid that kind of suffering. The legal resolution of Robert's case also provided answers about other mysterious deaths and disappearances connected to his network. Federal investigators linked the organization to 17 unsolved murders, spanning 3 decades, bringing closure to families who had never known what happened to their loved ones. But perhaps the most important aspect of justice was the protection it provided for future victims. Robert's conviction and the dismantling of his network eliminated a criminal enterprise that had been growing and expanding for over 30 years. Without your cooperation, Agent Rodriguez told me during a celebration dinner 6 months after the sentencing, Robert's operation would have continued indefinitely. Your courage to seek truth and justice saved dozens of children who were being recruited for exploitation. The investigation had also led to legislative changes that strengthened oversight of private adoptions and made it more difficult for criminals to exploit vulnerable children through fraudulent placements. As I reflected on the long journey from that anniversary dinner at Romano's to the federal courthouse where justice was finally served, I realized that my story wasn't really about victimization or revenge. It was about the power of love to survive even the most sophisticated manipulation and abuse. Rebecca's love had motivated her to fight for my freedom even when it cost her life. David's love had sustained 20 years of investigation and evidence gathering. Patricia's love had preserved our family history and prepared for my eventual return. That love had ultimately proven stronger than Robert's criminal enterprise, more enduring than his psychological manipulation, and more powerful than his threats and violence. Justice wasn't just about punishment for the guilty. It was about affirming that every child deserves protection, every family deserves truth, and every victim deserves the opportunity to reclaim their life and identity. Robert Stevens had thought he could control the narrative of my life indefinitely, but he had underestimated the power of authentic human connection and the determination of people who refuse to accept injustice. 2 years after Robert's sentencing, I stood in the backyard of my new home in Denver watching David and Patricia plant a memorial garden for Rebecca. The house was just 10 minutes from where my biological parents had lived before I was taken from them, bringing our family story full circle. Rebecca always loved gardening, David said as he positioned a rose bush near a stone bench we had installed in her memory. She said watching things grow gave her hope for the future. Patricia arranged white lilies around the memorial stone we had engraved with Rebecca's name and the words, "Beloved mother, sister, and fighter for justice." The garden would bloom every spring, ensuring that Rebecca's memory remained vibrant and alive. The house itself was everything Rebecca had dreamed of providing for me: a safe neighborhood with good schools, space for a family to grow, and a sense of permanence that I had never experienced during my childhood with Robert and Carol. "Janet, Patricia," called from the garden. "David and I have something for you." They led me to a small greenhouse David had built behind the house, where dozens of seedlings were growing in carefully labeled containers. Vegetables, herbs, and flowers that would eventually fill the memorial garden and provide fresh produce for our family meals. Rebecca left detailed plans for a garden she wanted to plant with you someday. David explained, showing me pages from Rebecca's journal that described her dreams for our future home. She researched native plants, seasonal growing cycles, and sustainable farming techniques. Even in death, Rebecca was still teaching me and providing for my future. Her plans for the garden included educational elements that would help children learn about nature responsibility and the satisfaction of nurturing living things. "The greenhouse will be the Rebecca Morrison Learning Center," Patricia announced. "Children from the Foundation's programs will come here to participate in horticultural therapy and learn job skills they can use in legitimate careers." The integration of Rebecca's memory with practical assistance for vulnerable children felt perfectly consistent with the woman I had come to know through her letters and journals. She would have wanted her death to inspire programs that protected other children from exploitation. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Rodriguez. "Conviction upheld on appeal. Robert's life sentence is final." Robert's legal team had spent 2 years challenging his conviction, but federal appeals courts had consistently affirmed the original verdict. At 62 years old, Robert would spend the remainder of his life in federal prison, never again able to harm children or manipulate vulnerable families. "Good news?" David asked, noticing my expression. "The best news," I replied, showing him the message from Agent Rodriguez. "Robert's appeals are exhausted. Justice is truly final now." Patricia hugged me with tears in her eyes. "Rebecca can finally rest in peace. knowing her killer will never hurt another family. The legal finality was important, but the emotional healing had been a longer and more complex process. Through extensive therapy and the support of my biological family, I had learned to distinguish between authentic emotions and the conditioned responses Robert had programmed into me during my childhood. Building a healthy relationship with anger has been the most difficult part, I told my therapist during our weekly session. For 28 years, I was taught that anger was dangerous and disloyal. Learning to feel and express anger appropriately has taken time. Dr. Sarah Mitchell nodded with understanding. Children who experience psychological manipulation often struggle with trusting their own emotions as adults. Your anger at Robert and Carol is completely justified and healthy. The therapy process had also helped me understand that my identity wasn't defined by the trauma I had experienced or the crimes committed against me. I was Rebecca Morrison's daughter, raised by David Morrison and Patricia Morrison, with my own dreams, abilities, and potential for creating positive change in the world. The Rebecca Morrison Foundation had become my full-time career, allowing me to transform personal pain into meaningful action. We had helped reunite 43 families affected by adoption fraud, provided counseling for over 800 victims of child trafficking, and successfully lobbied for legislative reforms that strengthened protections for vulnerable children. The Foundation's work is Rebecca's true legacy, I said during a television interview about adoption reform. She died fighting to protect children from exploitation, and we're carrying that fight forward in her memory. The interview was part of a documentary about Robert's criminal network that had aired on national television, educating the public about the sophisticated techniques criminals use to exploit adoption systems and manipulate vulnerable families. Your story gives hope to other victims, the interviewer observed. What advice would you give to someone who discovers their family isn't what they believed it to be? Trust your instincts, I replied. If something feels wrong, investigate those feelings rather than dismissing them. And remember that healing is possible even when the truth is more painful than you imagined. The documentary had generated hundreds of emails from viewers who suspected they might be victims of adoption fraud or family manipulation. The Foundation's intake coordinators were working with law enforcement agencies across the country to investigate potential cases and provide support for affected families. But perhaps the most meaningful validation of our work came from the children who had been rescued from Robert's operation. 11 young people who had been imprisoned at the Oregon facility were now thriving in foster care, therapeutic residential programs, or reunification with their biological families. Ms. Janet, 16-year-old Marcus Williams, said during a Foundation event, "Thank you for not giving up when things got scary. If you hadn't been brave enough to fight back, we'd still be trapped." Marcus had been held at the Oregon facility for 8 months before federal agents rescued him. He was now living with relatives in California and planned to study criminal justice in college so he could help other victims of child trafficking. "You don't need to thank me," I replied. "Your survival and recovery is the greatest gift you could give to everyone who fought to bring you home." Stories like Marcus's reminded me that seeking justice hadn't just been about personal healing. It had been about protecting other children and ensuring that Robert's criminal enterprise couldn't continue destroying young lives. David and Patricia had both found renewed purpose through the Foundation's work. David used his construction skills to build therapeutic facilities and safe houses for rescued children, while Patricia developed medical protocols for treating trauma survivors. "Working with these kids helps me understand what Rebecca went through," Patricia told me as we reviewed applications for Foundation scholarships. "She must have felt so alone and desperate when she was fighting to find you." The scholarship program provided educational funding for young adults who had survived trafficking or exploitation, helping them build legitimate careers and independent lives. Rebecca's trust fund, combined with assets recovered from Robert's criminal enterprise, had grown large enough to support dozens of students each year. "Rebecca would be amazed by what you've accomplished," David said as we toured the Foundation's new residential facility for trafficking survivors. She dreamed of protecting children, but she could never have imagined the scope of what you've built in her memory. The residential facility housed 12 young people who were recovering from severe trauma while completing their education and learning job skills. The program had a 93% success rate for transitioning survivors into independent, productive lives. As I walked through the facility's common areas, seeing young people who had survived the worst kinds of abuse now laughing, studying, and planning for their futures, I felt a profound sense of purpose that Robert's manipulation had never provided. Janet called 18-year-old Sarah Chen as I passed the study hall. "Can you help me with my college application essay?" Sarah had been rescued from a trafficking operation similar to Robert's and was applying to nursing school. Her essay described how her traumatic experiences had motivated her to pursue a career helping other survivors. "What do you want to say about your experiences?" I asked as we sat down to work on her essay. "I want people to understand that we're not broken," Sarah replied. "We're strong because we survived things that would destroy most people. That strength can be used to help others if we get the right support." Her perspective perfectly captured the philosophy that guided the Foundation's work. Survivors weren't victims to be pitied, but resilient individuals with valuable perspectives and abilities that could benefit society. As evening fell and I prepared to leave the residential facility, I received a call from Agent Rodriguez with unexpected news. "Janet, we found something in Robert's prison cell that you need to see," she said. "He's been writing letters that reveal additional information about his criminal network." Robert had been using his time in prison to document crimes and victims that federal investigators had never discovered. Whether motivated by guilt, boredom, or continued narcissism, his writings were providing closure for families who had lost children to his operation decades ago. "He's written detailed accounts of 17 murders we couldn't prove during the trial," Agent Rodriguez continued. "His confessions are allowing us to notify families and provide proper burials for victims." Even in prison, Robert's need for recognition was generating evidence that brought healing to families who had spent years wondering what happened to their loved ones. The next morning, I met with David and Patricia to discuss how the Foundation should respond to these new revelations. Robert's confessions would likely generate additional media attention and requests for assistance from newly identified victims' families. "We should expand our victim services program," Patricia suggested. "Families who learn the truth about decades-old disappearances will need specialized support." David nodded in agreement. Rebecca's story shows how important it is for families to have answers even when the truth is painful. As we planned the Foundation's response to Robert's confessions, I reflected on the long journey from that anniversary dinner at Romano's to this moment of purposeful action on behalf of other victims. The scared, confused young woman who had torn up a counterfeit $1,000 bill had become someone capable of building institutions, advocating for legislative change, and providing hope for survivors of the worst kinds of abuse. But the most important transformation had been internal, learning to trust my own judgment, value authentic relationships, and believe in my capacity to create positive change in the world. Life lesson learned. I said to David and Patricia as we finished our planning session, "True family isn't determined by legal documents or shared genetics. It's created by people who choose to love, protect, and support each other unconditionally." Rebecca had chosen to love me enough to die protecting me. David had chosen to spend 20 years seeking justice for our family. Patricia had chosen to preserve our history and prepare for my eventual return home. Those choices had created a family bond stronger than any manipulation Robert could devise, a bond that survived murder, separation, lies, and decades of trauma to ultimately triumph over evil. Janet, Patricia said as we prepared to leave the Foundation office, "Rebecca would be proud of the woman you've become and the life you've built." "She would be proud of all of us," I replied, looking at the memorial garden visible through the office windows. We honored her sacrifice by refusing to let evil have the final word in our story. As we walked through the garden Rebecca had planned for us, surrounded by the flowers and vegetables she had dreamed of sharing with her daughter, I felt a sense of peace and completeness that 28 years of manipulation had never been able to destroy. The little girl who had been stolen from her family was finally home, and home wasn't just a place or a group of people. It was the knowledge that love, truth, and justice were worth fighting for no matter how long the battle takes or how powerful the forces arrayed against them. Rebecca Morrison's daughter had learned to fight, to survive, to heal, and to transform pain into purpose. That was her mother's greatest gift and her own greatest achievement. The story that began with a counterfeit $1,000 bill in a restaurant had become a testament to the power of authentic love to overcome even the most sophisticated evil, and that truth would continue to inspire hope for survivors and families seeking justice for generations to come. Have you ever felt like something was wrong with your family situation but couldn't quite put your finger on what it was? Trust those instincts. Sometimes our gut feelings are trying to protect us from manipulation we haven't consciously recognized yet. Your story matters, and seeking truth takes incredible courage, but it's always worth it in the end. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of your own journey toward healing and justice, please like this video, subscribe to stay connected with stories of survival and hope. Share this with someone who might need to hear Rebecca's message of never giving up on love, and let me know in the comments what family truly means to you. Thank you for listening to this story and for being part of a community that believes every child deserves protection and every family deserves truth. May you find the courage to seek your own authentic path, and may love always prove stronger than fear in your life. Until next time, remember that you are worthy of genuine love and that your truth matters more than anyone's comfortable lies.